Hi friends, I'm Dr. Emma Diaz and I am a licensed psychologist and I specialize in treating trauma. On this channel, we talk a lot about trauma therapy, mental health, those kinds of things. Remember that this is not therapy, this is not a substitute for therapy, it's not clinical advice. It's general information to help you better understand what trauma therapy is, if you might need it, and how it might look. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what trauma therapy is and how you might know if you need trauma therapy. So many people seek out a therapist, and you can find a billion profiles online, and they all sound the exact same, right? I help people through hard situations. I help people uncover their best, truest version of themselves. And it's really hard to tell what kind of therapy that person might practice. There are a million different types of theoretical orientations and techniques that therapists use. For most of us, we have a theoretical orientation, which is a way we view how a problem develops and how you fix that problem, but most clients have no idea what that is. And to be honest, you don't really need to know what someone's theoretical orientation is. You need to know if they're a good fit for you, if how they view the problem maps onto how you view the problem, and if there's research and clinical data behind what they're doing. We want to do things that are effective, that have been shown to work for folks. When I say trauma therapy, here is what I mean. There are things called trauma-informed therapies or trauma-informed therapists. That means that someone is aware of how the trauma impacts you. They can talk about the impact it has. They can talk about the symptoms you have. They're respectful of your autonomy. They're respectful of pushing you, but not overextending you, and they're understanding of how the trauma impacts your life. You can have a trauma-informed therapist that works on you with your depression, or a trauma-informed therapist that works on you with your anxiety. Being trauma-informed is a wonderful, great thing, but there's a difference between being trauma-informed and being trauma-focused. In my practice, I do trauma-focused therapy. That means that I still use a trauma-informed lens. I still understand how the trauma impacts you, talk about symptoms, I'm sensitive to things. But it also means that we are going to talk about the trauma. We are not going to talk around the trauma. So many people spend years and years in therapy spinning their wheels talking about the problems without talking about the root cause of the trauma. In trauma-focused therapy, we are digging in to what actually happened, how you felt when it happened, so that your brain can process it and it can start to realize that that trauma is a memory and it's not happening in the present moment. It's not still happening. Anytime folks get trauma triggers, their brain is telling them that the trauma is happening in this moment. Trauma-focused therapy helps your brain realize that it's a memory and it's not actually happening right now. There is so much power to talking about the trauma instead of talking around the trauma. So many traumas are steeped in shame and guilt and self-doubt and self-blame. And when we don't talk about the trauma, what ends up happening is you end up sort of having this tug of war in your brain of, was it my fault? Was it not my fault? Should I have done this? Should I have done that? How should I have reacted? And it's only by talking about the actual trauma that you can start to get rid of the shame and guilt and self-doubt so that you can feel more confident in yourself, more compassionate with yourself, less shame and stigma, but also so that your brain can start to make sense of the memory. We'll talk about this another time, but when folks have trauma, the memories are oftentimes very scattered all over the place. They don't make sense. Trauma therapy helps you make sense of what happened so you can finally start to process it as a memory. If you're still with me, you might be watching this wondering, well, do I need trauma therapy? And there are a few key ways to tell if someone needs trauma therapy. There's 4 things that I routinely see people come in with that are a good indication that trauma therapy might be a good fit for you. Number 4, if you are living in reactive mode instead of proactive mode. If you're constantly finding yourself in relationships, situations, engaging in behaviors that aren't good for you. And it's only when you're already in the middle of it that you look around and realize, whoa, this is not where I want to be. Whoa, this is not how I want to be reacting. People that are in the middle of a trauma response are often reacting to their environment almost like a game of Frogger. As things come to you, you react to them. You're not thinking about the future because the trauma has sucked you so far into the past that you are barely surviving the present. It is a struggle every day to get through. So if you find that you're not looking forward, you don't have to look too far forward, but if you're not looking forward to the type of person you want to be, the type of job you want to have, the type of mom you want to be, if you're not forward thinking and you're always struggling just to survive the moment because you always find yourself in these really chaotic or overwhelming situations, that might be a good indicator that you are experiencing a trauma response that is really impacting your life. The third thing is if you can't control your emotions, and this is really related to the fourth thing too, right? When you find yourself overwhelmed and your emotions feel out of control. A lot of folks that I meet with really struggle to control their emotions. They find themselves having angry outbursts. They're constantly fighting with their spouse. They're constantly fighting with their kids. They're constantly getting in these cycles of feeling really overwhelmed, upset, disappointed, agitated, frustrated, hopeless. And those feelings consume them. It feels like a wave that crashes over them and threatens to take them under. If you find that your emotions completely wipe you out, that you are so overwhelmed with them, that might be a good indication that trauma therapy can help you start to work through those emotions and lessen the intensity of them. The second indication is if your relationships are struggling. Maybe you've always had trouble with relationships, and so it's nothing new, but you're just tired of feeling like you're in these relationships that are really up and down and up and down. There's a lot of struggle, there's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of arguing. Or maybe it's new. Maybe you've been kind of floating along and then a trauma happens, or a trauma reminder happens that triggers a previous trauma, and suddenly your relationship feels really chaotic and strained. Many of the folks that I meet with come in because their partner, their spouse, their kids ask them to. They say, can you please get help for this because it's really weighing on you. I don't even think you realize how much it's impacting you. And they do it at the request of someone else. I recently was having some eye problems and I was complaining about it. And my partner was like, you have been complaining about this for a few weeks. Why don't you schedule an eye doctor appointment? And I looked at her and I said, that's a brilliant idea. Why didn't I think of that? But this happens so commonly in our life. We struggle and then we slowly get used to the struggle and we forget that there's help. And oftentimes the people in our lives can see it more clearly than we can. So it might be a good indication that you need trauma therapy if you are struggling in your relationships, if they seem really hard, really overwhelming, they're up and down instead of fairly stable. Or if you're not noticing anything, but the people around you start saying, hey, are you okay? Do you need some help? It seems like you've really been struggling since this thing happened. That might be a really good indication that trauma therapy could help you. The number one thing I see folks come in for trauma-focused therapy to address is their ability to function in their daily life. This is the number one thing that I see that I recommend. If you are noticing this, please consider calling a therapist in your area or a trauma specialist in your area to get some help. What do I mean when I say having trouble functioning? Like, what does that even mean? It can mean a lot of different things. You can be having trouble with your activities of daily living. These are basic things that people should be able to do if they are of average intellectual functioning, average emotional functioning. You should be able to do these things. These are things like being able to pay your bills, remembering to pick your kids up from school, washing your hair, washing your body, taking a shower, drinking water throughout the day and feeding yourself. Things, when you think of what an adult should be able to do, those types of things. Are you showing up to work on time? Are you getting your work done? Are you able to help your kids when they have problems with their homework? Like, are you just functioning in your daily life? Are you brushing your teeth? Things like that. They can be things that are so simple. Like, are you brushing your hair? Are you brushing your teeth? Has it been a week and a half since you took a shower because you just couldn't get yourself to get off of the couch and do it, or you just couldn't get yourself to deal with the overwhelm that came when you thought about taking a shower? It can also be things in your work life. Are you having trouble getting along with your coworkers? Suddenly, these little things that used to bother you become these huge things, and you find yourself either blowing up with them or not able to work with other people. Are you struggling to complete your homework assignments or work projects on time? You're constantly asking for extensions, or your boss is constantly on your case asking, like, when are you going to do this? This is late. Have you done this? Maybe you're constantly needing to take off of work early, or you're coming in late every day. You're finding that each day getting up and getting to the office is harder and harder, and you're struggling just to make it through the whole day, or you're struggling even to make it in the morning. You might also be having trouble struggling in your relationships, like we talked about with number 2, right? Maybe this relationship that used to seem really solid and wonderful is feeling really fraught, up and down. There's a lot of distress there, and you just can't get along with other people anymore. You're constantly fighting or arguing. Maybe you can't even drive down the street before you're, yelling at people or cutting people off in traffic, or so angry that you can't even make it through. Some folks even have trouble driving. I've met with a lot of folks who've slowly stopped driving, or a lot of folks who've slowly stopped doing other things in life. They used to go to the grocery store every day. Now they order all of their stuff online. They used to go into the office, but now with teleworking, they never go in, even if it would be helpful for them, or even if they miss the office environment. They've slowly stopped going to work. They've slowly stopped doing things that they used to enjoy. If you're finding that you can't even make it through a day without doing things that normal people do because it feels so incredibly overwhelming, then you're having trouble functioning, and it is a great time to look for a therapist in your area, especially one that focuses on trauma if the core reason behind these problems is trauma. That's one thing to keep in mind too. There's lots of different disorders and symptoms that overlap, right? Depression can look similar to trauma in some ways, and we'll talk about this more in the future. The key to knowing if a trauma-focused therapy is going to be right for you is if these symptoms started following a trauma. Let's say you were sexually assaulted and 3 months later these things started coming up. 6 months later you started really having trouble with these feelings of overwhelm and despair. Or if you experienced a reminder of the trauma that was really upsetting to you. Sometimes folks will be sort of floating along, and maybe they were assaulted when they're 16, and then their child turns 16, and they have these flood of trauma symptoms. They don't know why, but it's because they're having this reminder of, oh my gosh, that's how old I was. And I was just a baby. I never realized how young I was before. I never realized how much this took away from me. Or maybe their child has an experience with an unwanted sexual encounter or a sexual assault or something that just left a bad taste in their mouth. Maybe it's not a trauma, but maybe it's something that felt bad, and it's a reminder of the trauma that the parent experienced. If your symptoms started after trauma or after a trauma reminder or trigger, that can be a really good indication. These things are important to remember. Trauma-focused care is really, really important after a trauma or after a trauma trigger or reminder that impacts you. And the ways you might be able to tell if trauma therapy is going to help you is if you're always stuck in reaction mode. It's hard to look forward because the present is so overwhelming. If you just can't control your emotions, no matter what you try, no matter what you do, you're constantly blowing up or crying for just extended amounts of time and you can't control how you feel. If you're really struggling in your relationships, they're really up and down, or you're constantly fighting or if you're having trouble functioning in your daily life. If you're finding that the things you used to do effortlessly or with minimal effort, you can't do it all now. You're not showering, you're not going to work, you're not feeding yourself, things like that. Those are good indications that trauma therapy will be helpful. I really hope this information has been helpful. If you think there are things I've missed, please comment below. If you've heard of trauma-focused care before, give a thumbs up if that's something that you've noticed and you've heard about before and you actually knew, what we were talking about today. If you've never heard about that, maybe you've been in therapy forever and no one has ever recommended a trauma-focused care, which is oftentimes shorter in length because you don't want to be doing trauma-focused care for 5 years. It is exhausting. It is hard work. You want to do it in a shorter period and really focus in on it. If these words have never been said to you, you've never heard of the idea of trauma-focused care before, give a thumbs down. I would love to know who's heard of trauma-focused care and who hasn't, because it can be very different than general mental health counseling. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.